It's now afternoon. If I could have your attention for a minute, I'm going to introduce our lunchtime keynote speaker. My name is Don Fullerton. I'm a professor of finance here at UIUC, and I'm in the Institute of Government and Public Affairs and on the steering committee for iSEE, so lots of different roles here. It is my privilege this afternoon to introduce you to Dr. Matthew Kahn, professor of economics, spatial science, and environmental studies at the University of Southern California, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics. He's taught at Columbia, the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and at UCLA. And he's served as a visiting professor at Harvard and Stanford, and as a distinguished visiting professor at the National University of Singapore, so he gets around. So here's a quote I like. According to a profile written about him while he was at UCLA, quote, "You normally don't expect a preeminent economist to be amusingly funny and an avid People magazine subscriber who deftly weaves Britney Spears' name into an ingenious discourse about climate change, but then you meet Matthew Kahn." Just to indicate his sense of humor and energy. He's a fervent writer, posting several times a week to his environmental and urban economics blog. He's the author of 6 books, including his most recent title is Blue Skies Over Beijing, Economic Growth and the Environment in China, which he co-authored with Siki Zheng. And Climatopolis, for which I have a copy right here, if I'm holding the front forward, in which he takes readers on a tour of the world's cities to present a positive yet realistic picture of what our urban future will look like as we adapt our daily lives to climate change. And from the look of today's title, it might indicate that Houston and Miami have some adaptation yet to do in their story for Climatopolis. You'll have to write an updated edition when we get some action on those fronts. Matt, the floor is yours.
Folks, thank you so much. And there's no free lunch, but I'll try to make this a low-cost, interesting, quick lunch. It was a terrific morning. I learned a lot, and it's great to be in an interdisciplinary setting. And so I thank the organizers so much for inviting me, and I hope that this is interesting. Hurricane Harvey shocked me, and I want to share some thoughts, some of which might be a little bit controversial. I'm going to speak for about 25 minutes, and then I'm hoping we can have a good group discussion and I can make some new friends. So folks, what fascinates me, I'm an environmental and urban economist, and we always knew San Francisco has great weather. Houston's a little more humid. I'm very interested in how cities compete with each other to attract young people. So for the young people in this room, where will you live your lives after you graduate? Cities compete to try to attract you. It's increasingly clear to me that urban resilience will be another attribute of cities. There's always been the unemployment rate, housing prices. There's always been, is it nice in summertime? Is it sophisticated? But urban resilience will be another attribute of cities. And I list here a couple of my recent publications, if any of this interests you. Folks, what interests me very much, and I'm an economist, I'm not a climate scientist, I know who I am. We just ran a horrible natural experiment. When you drop 11 trillion gallons of water on a small geographic space, what happens next? What happens to fatalities, damage to the capital stock, and to productivity? And folks, do we learn from our past blunders, or do we just keep making the same mistakes over and over again? I, as an economist, want to talk about this. So, economists talk about fat tail risk and that climate change raises the probability of truly horrible outcomes, such as water hitting the ground. The very great economist Martin Weitzman of Harvard has talked about the economic losses associated with fat tail events. I have the greatest of respect for Martin Weitzman, but in the typical model that macroeconomists have been writing down, there has not been a spatial component to adaptation. As Sandy's paper earlier today talked about, in agricultural markets, you need to consider multiple markets when thinking about the effects of shocks. Folks, the bottom bullet point. In my brief remarks, I'm not going to bore you about general equilibrium. What I want to talk about are the bottom 3 points. When Mother Nature throws punches, they're partially anticipated. We partially see these punches coming. We're also risk averse, that we buy life insurance, that we buy car insurance. And many of us, I've always been very interested in the Don Rumsfeld, known unknowns versus unknown unknowns. Many of us know that we don't know what punches Mother Nature's going to throw at us. And how do we set up our lives, whether we're poor, whether we're rich? How do we use markets to protect ourselves from ambiguous, but the New York Times teaches us each day, Justin Gillis's pieces on a weekly basis. We have more and more information about the punches that are coming our way. Even climate deniers can't deny that they've been warned. What happens next in a capitalist system? And folks, one of my themes, and one of the themes of Climatopolis, is one person's misery is another person's opportunity. Mark Zuckerberg saw that people wanted social connections, and he dreamed up Facebook. That was not exploiting people who wanted social connections. He saw a need. Elon Musk sees entrepreneurial openings in the electric vehicle market. For the challenges that have been discussed for the last 2.5 days, these are very real challenges. But capitalism comes up with cures when there's demand. If there was only one bald man in the world, we wouldn't get Rogaine. When enough people, I see no laughs, this is a tough room. Thank you, economists at the front table. If there is enough demand for solutions, capitalist firms step in, irregardless of what the public sector is doing. And we'll come back to that. Folks, part of me is thrilled, and we should be thrilled. We should be horrified by the loss of life caused by Hurricane Harvey. But one of the themes of my early work on the death toll from natural disasters is with economic growth, we grow more resilient. Of course, there's been work that more and more of us live in coastal settings, but as we grow richer, we live in higher quality housing and we have better hospitals and emergency care to protect us after disasters. Something that the New York Times hasn't fully explored after Hurricane Harvey is this terrific issue of how low, in the face of 11 trillion gallons of water, has been the death count. I would point to the role of self-protection and the role of the evacuations and the role of the cell phone economy, which I'll come back to. That in our big data economy, this terrific first responders response, many of whom were the private sector in this big data economy, and this rising potential for adaptation because of the new economy. Folks, another point. I've done writing on adapting to terrorism versus adapting to natural disasters. In the case of natural disasters, there is a spatial correlation to these shocks. Same areas get shocked again and again. There's a predictability of these patterns. But folks, the rational terrorist doesn't hit the same target twice. Why do we keep taking our shoes off at airports? We're wasting our time in a cost-benefit sense. The rational terrorist has a lack of predictability in where he strikes. Mother Nature, because she's not a strategic opponent, there's a predictability there that helps us to adapt, and this has clear implications. So folks, the third bullet point, real estate prices reflect fundamentals. If areas are increasingly risky, real estate prices will fall in those areas and they will become poverty magnets and poverty traps. I think that's a very important point and something that the men and women in this room are already working on. But because of the spatial predictability of climate shocks, this creates strong incentives for the insurance industry, and we can talk about FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program, but in a for-profit world where we had risk pricing, the insurance industry can be a very positive institution, sending signals even to climate deniers about actions they can take, putting homes on stilts, homes built out of more resilient materials that raise our resilience. I'm going to come back in a couple of moments to the zoning code and to population density. So folks, I view cities as bundles of attributes. For those of you from Urbana-Champaign, you could list what you love about this city. I'm from Los Angeles. I love seeing Kobe Bryant and working on my tan. Tough room. If you met a space alien and tried to describe to the space alien what Houston is, you might say it's an oil refining town. You might say that it's humid, that it has cheap houses. You might talk about its history and food. Whether Houston is the American dream differs for different people. If you have a taste for large, cheap housing, Houston may still be the American dream for you. If you want to be in a diverse city, it may not be the right city for you. Houston has much cheaper housing than San Francisco. Millions of people live in San Francisco. Millions of people live in Houston. Different people have different visions of the American dream. Does Harvey change things? That question interests me very much. Does Harvey shift Houston's bundle of attributes? So many of you go to Starbucks, even though its prices are high. It's a high-quality cup of coffee. Houston has cheap housing relative to San Francisco. Has your view of Houston in terms of its quality gone down, or just neighborhoods within Houston? Will certain neighborhoods in Houston rise in home price because they're now viewed as more valuable because you view them as less flood prone? Folks, this is from Paul Krugman's blog, and let's do this together because it's a little bit complicated. This is from September 3rd. What Paul Krugman wants you to see here, folks, does everybody see that Atlanta has a large population and it's sprawled? It has a low population density. Everyone say, yes, economist. Notice that Dallas is less sprawled. Notice what you're supposed to see here is that San Francisco and LA are more dense. Density is population per unit of land area. Holding population constant, San Francisco and Los Angeles are more dense, and New York is really dense relative to Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta. The point that Paul Krugman wanted to make in his blog was the following. Paul Krugman wanted to say that an unintended consequence of Houston people living in single-family homes versus living in multifamily apartment buildings is that they paved over wetlands and set up their own flooding of the city. That Houston is a flood-prone area and that the floods were accelerated and accentuated because of the paving. What interests a slight libertarian economist like me is the following question. Sprawl has benefits and costs. When you live in a single-family home, you derive private benefits, more privacy, more personal space, larger space, but you impose social costs on others. If Houston families have chosen to sprawl, how much more risk have they exposed themselves to? How much less flood risk would there have been in Houston if there was more wetlands? I think that's a topic for ecological scientists to work on. But folks, the bottom bullet point is very important. Paul Krugman lives in New York City, and it's easy for him, and I'm from New York City. My parents are from New York City. It's easy for urbanites like me who live in multifamily housing. I live in China part of the year in apartment buildings. For people with a taste for multifamily housing, it's easy to say, tss, tss, give up your single-family homes, move into an apartment complex, and you will face less flood risk because you can set lands aside as wetlands. But on some level, that violates consumer sovereignty. A very interesting point is if some people have a taste for single-family homes, there's no free lunch, as you guys are learning right now. You didn't pay for this lunch, but you're paying because you have to listen to this boring stuff. Are the people of Houston who live in flood-prone areas adults? Do we believe in buyer beware? If you buy a cheap house, but it's in a flood-prone area, what do we make of that? Or do we want to forbid you from making that choice? And to an economist, what consumer sovereignty do you lose if society forces you through different zoning codes to live in multifamily housing, but to be safer? What risks do we allow people to take in this climate-changing world interests me very much. So folks, we all know that we keep rebuilding. I'm very interested in, do we learn from our past mistakes? The Who had that song, "We Won't Be Fooled Again." Something that interests me very much is, do we learn from our mistakes? Or if we see people rebuild, is this an unintended consequence of government policy? Let me read you a couple of these. There's benefits of rebuilding in a Houston that middle-class people have access to cheap housing. We're very worried about the American dream for middle-class households. But again, as we said a moment ago, when we convert too much wetlands into concrete, you raise flood risks for all. Folks, the bottom bullet point. As a free market environmentalist, I'd ask you to consider the following, and I don't know if this was discussed today. Why don't property owners in Houston tax themselves through a mechanism or through private contributions, create a land trust, and purchase land in low-lying areas where homes have been destroyed, set those lands aside as a wetland to reduce future flood risk. So, folks, I heard many presentations today on the role of government in protecting urbanites. A complementary role is the role of property owners to protect their property, purchase other people's property, set it aside as wetlands. I know that I don't know all the answers for how we're going to adapt to climate change, but how we harness free markets to reduce our risks if we're aware that we face more of these risks. Politics and adaptation. Folks, this interests me very much if there's any political scientists in the room. Many congressmen and congresswomen are place-based. They are the person in their district is a physical place. Chris Christie was hugging President Obama after Hurricane Sandy. Folks, do you remember that hug? It was a good hug. But folks, at the heart of that hug was the pursuit of pork. Is Governor Christie a fan of President Obama? I'm a fan of President Obama. Governor Christie was looking for a bailout of his region. And he's a place-based official looking for federal money. Something that interests me very much is when one of the themes of Climatopolis, which was not popular, and everyone get ready to boo, is local areas should pay for their own defenses. We can talk about poor cities, but if an area becomes riskier because of climate change, local property owners have a less valuable asset. Is everybody with me? If crime goes up in your neighborhood, home prices fall. If school quality gets better, home prices rise. If an area becomes riskier because of climate change, home prices fall. Local homeowners have strong incentives to come up with public policies and funding mechanisms to protect their own area. If cities on higher ground cross-subsidize coastal cities, that actually creates spatial moral hazard. The coastal cities are spending other people's money to making their own property more valuable, and that bugs me. And that's what I meant by this bullet point, the distortion in location decisions. I'll give an example. We're very worried that Miami can flood. If Chicago is taxed to pay for Miami's seawalls, more people may move to Miami. Folks, does everyone see that that may not help us to adapt to climate change? That's what I mean by the distortion in location decisions. If Miami wants seawalls, the property owners in Miami should pay for their seawalls. If you say to me, Matt, there are poor coastal cities, there I agree with you. And for poor coastal cities, there we face a Rawlsian issue of how do we protect poor people to make sure that poor people don't overly cluster in the most risky places. And then we're back to the wetlands, we're back to zoning rules to protect this needy group, and I agree. Folks, my new work. Kerry Smith and I are now working on the question, and we talked about this a moment ago, so I can pick up speed. If a given geographic area suffers because of climate change, home prices will fall there. Folks, I'm interested in whether there's parts of Canada whether their quality of life will improve in relative terms because of climate change. And so in the paper by Sandy, he talked about general equilibrium effects of farming. Similar issues arise here. Each of us chooses where to live our lives. If coastal areas suffer, for those who are mobile, they can move to higher ground. The bottom 2 points. Folks, if you have a wonderful condo in Miami, and you've loved it, and you paid $600,000 for it, but now climate change makes it a $300,000 condo. Can we all agree you're angry you've had an asset loss of $300,000? Everyone say, yes, nerd. Folks, but do you have a property right to those initial conditions? If Mark Zuckerberg died tomorrow, and I hope he doesn't, the price of Facebook would go down. Would the owners of Facebook shares have the right to sue the federal government for a transfer? No. When you buy a stock, you're making a bet, and you want the new news to be good, but if it's bad, you lose. I need you to explain to me what's the difference between buying a house in a given city versus owning shares in a company. It's as if coastal individuals want to have the house price appreciation if it keeps becoming more beautiful, but they want a federal bailout if there are shocks. Folks, flipping one-sided coins is nice, but that creates very bad incentives. So for the philosophers in this room, are incumbent property owners, are they allowed to pass on the bad news to the nation's taxpayers? And I hope the answer is no, even though that's a little bit of tough love. And now I say I'm being booed. Folks, I can take it. Yeah, I can take it. My own mother didn't like Climatopolis. That hurt. Let's do the bottom bullet point because Don wants me to wrap up to set up group discussion. Folks, I'm very interested in the resilience of our urban productivity. For example, the Rice University opened immediately that week. It was closed for a couple of days. I'm very interested in which of our industries outside of agriculture, there's very little agriculture except for pot growing, that was a joke, in cities. Thank you, and good night. Given that our industries are inside, whether it's Amazon, I recognize that oil refining was affected by Harvey. We've made a mistake having so much of our refining in one city. You want to hold a more diversified portfolio. Because when Harvey hit, there were other parts of the country that were not hit. If we have refining more spread out, we hold a more diversified portfolio, and there'll just be general equilibrium effects. The refineries in Houston would reduce production, but other refineries in unaffected areas would have a windfall. Do you remember that farmer who talked about in the previous section that he made profits during drought? Yeah. This is a serious one. And I do not discuss this enough in Climatopolis. In recent work with Leah Bustan of Princeton, what Leah and I did was we studied 90 years of natural disasters. And folks, the following result came out. I'm speaking too quickly. We looked at every natural disaster that occurred in the United States from the years 1920 till now. And we documented in those counties that suffer natural disasters, the poverty rate goes up. And our theory of this is that the poor are less mobile, and if natural disasters strike, real estate prices decline, and that becomes a poverty magnet. So I am very concerned, and I alluded to this a couple of minutes ago, that in those areas, in those geographic areas that are not resilient, that they will become poverty magnets. And I think that I'd love to talk in the Q&A about this. We know this. What public policies should we adopt to reduce this? While I am a University of Chicago economist, the Chicago economists are, let's read this bottom bullet point. Almost all Chicago economists support Milton Friedman's original basic income level. Milton Friedman and Bernie Sanders agree here, and also support Jim Heckman's call for universal pre-K. We could reduce poverty in our great country if there was a basic income floor paid for with a tax on the well-off, and I would support that, and if we also had pre-kindergarten for all. So another strategy for adapting to climate change is the human capital revolution and making sure that the least well-off have the ability to climb the ladder. 2 more slides and I'm done. Folks, I mentioned urban competition before. A controversial theme in my Climatopolis book was in a world where we are able to get up and go and migrate, we're going to be better able to adapt to climate change. Those regions, Detroit is poor right now because many skilled people don't want to live there. If it starts to have warmer winters, it might actually attract more skilled people. Chicago is a skilled city, which is cold. I'm very interested in how cities compete against each other. Jerry Brown in California keeps raising taxes, and rich people don't leave. Have you noticed that? Does Mitt Romney just like high taxes? It's because it's such a great place to live that Jerry Brown can have his bullet trade and tax the wealthy at very high rates. And the right tail complains, but then they don't move to Texas, even though the Wall Street Journal says move to Texas. Those cities with great quality of life continue to attract the very well-off and have a tax base. If climate change affects affects quality of life, if it introduces risk and uncertainty, there could be a brain drain from those places. Folks, by durable capital, I mean the following. Ed Glazer and Joe Giorco wrote the following great paper. They said what went wrong in Detroit was the following. When the jobs left Detroit in the 1960s and the 1970s, the houses remained because they're durable. When you have durable housing, but there's no demand to live in them, what happens to the price of real estate? It goes to zero, and that attracts poor people. Detroit became a poverty magnet because of durable capital. In the case of Miami, what worries me, again, is if areas become flooded, but there is durable housing that is partially still there, prices will fall, and that will become a poverty magnet, and the inequality effects I mentioned a moment ago will be exacerbated, and that worries me very much. Climate deniers. Folks, I have been asked, people have said, Matt, those who are climate realists will have many strategies to adapt to climate change. Did you know that a famous economist said to me that he's worried that all climate deniers will drown? They will purchase coastal real estate and then drown. And what I said back to him was the following. I said, there's a word called hypocrisy. There's what we do in public versus what we do in private, and what kind of person would give Fox News a monopoly for all of their information? And so my vision of climate deniers is that there's some combination of adaptation optimists and those who want to punch Al Gore a little. But we're all risk averse. We all want our children to thrive, to be healthy and comfortable. And if you have any doubt in your head, if you know that you don't know that the climate is changing, you will take actions, especially if the insurance industry rewards you to do so. For example, putting your house on stilts, having precautionary water in your basement. These are cheap insurance policies to protect yourself against disaster. And it will interest me if sociologists and psychologists push this line of thinking that the climate deniers are full-fledged climate deniers and are taking no preventative action and will be punched in the jaw in the coming days. That's a Hollywood movie. That would be delicious on some level, but I don't believe that. There is a difference between what people say in public versus what they do in private, and that's a testable hypothesis. Charles Tiebout was a great public finance economist, and he argued that people vote with their feet. If a city or a neighborhood declines in quality of life, homeowners will pay for this because there'll be less demand for their neighborhood. People can vote with their feet, especially young people. But folks, what happens to those who can't easily move? Now we're back again that rents will be lower and they will be poverty magnets. I'll give an example. My mother-in-law lives in Berkeley, and she's 80 years old. She has a PhD. She's very, very smart. She won't install air conditioning in her house. And her logic is that she just doesn't want to. She doesn't want these repair guys in. She's noticed that Berkeley is hotter. If the house had been brand new, she would have wanted air conditioning, but she doesn't want air conditioning. Because of this friction, because of this cost of adjustment cost, she hasn't taken a very standard action of having functioning air conditioning. And she's aware of this, but she doesn't care. So in my new research, I'm very interested in what subgroups of the population, the elderly, the poor, those who love the geographic area they're living in, are not taking steps to adapt. And an example, when I taught at Columbia University 25 years ago, I told people that I wouldn't buy a place in New York and I didn't have any friends. These were true. But I told people that the reason I chose not to have any friends, and folks, there's supply and demand. I told people that the reason I didn't have any friends and the reason I rented was because I could leave at the drop of a hat. If somebody angered me, if I got mugged, I would just leave the city and move to another university. And so in that sense, I was immune to shocks to New York City that didn't kill me. If some dean said weird things to me, just switch to another school, had no friends, had no ties to New York, and was ready to get up and go. But for those who have planted roots in a given area, for those who have planted roots, for those who have a job in a specific place, whose grandparents are from that place, whose friends are there, whose past is there, it's going to be much more difficult for these individuals to get up and go. And I think this migration costs, and some of the morning talks alluded to this, measuring these migration costs is very important. But folks, a note of optimism, and I'll be done in 2 minutes. Facebook has allowed me to reconnect with my high school friends, even though I'm 3,000 miles away from Scarsdale. So new technologies are allowing us to keep our roots, even if it isn't face-to-face. As we have more jobs that don't require face-to-face, dentistry requires face-to-face. But as we have more jobs and more socializing such that we don't have to be face-to-face, we open up adaptation margins that didn't exist. And this is the beauty of capitalism. To end on Hurricane Harvey, folks, did you notice that none of the canoe rescuers asked for Uber surge pricing? Or does someone have a counterexample? So what interests me very much, I love that people use their smartphones to find victims and rescue them. Titmuss was the guy who said if you pay for blood, people will stop giving blood. Hayek is the Nobel laureate who says if we have a price system, we'll get the efficient allocation of resources. When the next Harvey occurs, now that we have these decentralized first responders, will some Will some Uber app programmer program up a disaster app? And will there be surge pricing? What surge pricing would do, of course, it would price gouge at first those who are in desperate need. But it would increase the supply of first responders as men and women could get rich if they've got a canoe and they're ready to help. And if there are poor people, and I'm only cracking half a joke here, if there are poor people, there can be crowdsourcing to save other people. So my son watches these e-games where you watch people play video games. You folks don't find this funny, but this is the amazing thing of capitalism. As a disaster plays out in an area and as everyone watches it on their smartphone, if you can't get from Hawaii there on your canoe, you could send in $1,000 to some first responders to get them to go in. And this is decentralized capitalism at work. And this is the greatness of our economy, of how at high frequency we're beginning to adapt. And so don't walk away from my talk thinking this guy believes in magic. I am a full supporter of carbon taxes, but in the pursuit of nudging complacent suburbanites to adopt a carbon tax, we have underplayed the adaptation possibilities. In our ever-evolving economy, we are, out of self-interest, we continue to reorganize and move to higher ground. There's a question how we protect the poor and how we pay for this. But economists tend to be the optimists in discussions of policy because we view men and women as forward-looking and risk-averse. If we know that we don't know the threats we face, this creates market opportunities for entrepreneurs and out of self-interest creates strong incentives for individuals to seek coping strategies. My grandfather didn't have a cell phone. The word Google meant nothing to him. Capitalism is always about new products, more and more of which will help us to adapt to this challenge that we've unleashed. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that great talk. I like your idea of letting the market, we don't need the government so much, we can let the market play the role of making places that are riskier, more expensive, and have people moving out of that to other housing, other locations, and kind of let housing prices dictate actions that we want to take to sort of protect ourselves against climate change. But we know that markets work when there is certainty and in a sort of static sense. But when you're dealing with climate change, can you rely upon the market to make housing values go down in areas that may be subject to more climate risk in the future when we cannot really foresee that? And also, one of the talks that actually Amy Ander gave is that because we don't know which areas to protect, because we do not know which areas in the future, we may protect certain areas today, but then in the future we don't know, those may be the areas that in fact are destroyed by climate change. So how do you deal with that in a market setting where...
So this is a great question. I skipped the economics of Lego. Folks, how many of you still play with Lego? Honest person. On your excellent point. So folks, Devin Bunton and I just published the following paper. Notice her great question. She said, Matt, if we know that we don't know, I argued that there is predictability from the climate science. If the climate scientists really can't predict which areas face risk, their salaries should go down. Part of climate science should be about prediction. And I do believe that many of these men and women have earned their pay, that there is a predictability of tornadoes' paths, of where hurricanes hit. But let's assume that we don't know where these things strike, and we're worried that it's a uniform distribution. Folks, the mistake they made in Miami is they built buildings to live for 90 years. What if the building we're in was built to just last for 4 years? What if one of the mistakes we've made, young people, is we've built too durable of a capital stock? If we know that we don't know the future risks, if I were to write out a little bit of mathematics, what Devin Bunton and I do is, if durability is costly, but if floods could destroy a building, you can solve a simple calculus problem for what's the optimal durability to build. Don Trump assuming he wouldn't get payoffs from Russia, would build a much less durable capital stock if he thought that the land could be wiped out at any time. And so one of the points that Bunton and I make is one rational response to known unknowns is a less durable infrastructure stock. We won't get fooled again. I've quoted you the who twice. Now, folks, let me tell you about Lego, because I'm smarter than I look. With Lego, you build a structure, but you hold an option to disassemble it and take the pieces to higher ground. Is everyone with me? With Lego, at a cost, you can always disassemble. So in my new work on modular housing, we're going to build modular structures. USC actually just built a $1 billion prefabricated campus, so this university village. If we build a modular capital stock, and that's an example of the Zuckerberg kind of entrepreneurship we're going to have, if we build a modular capital stock that at a cost can be disassembled and dragged to higher ground, as we learn, we hold an option. Because I don't know if we spoke about this today. The economics of option value is as you learn new news, do you have an option to re-optimize or have you locked in? This is why courses have add drop dates. If it turns out you have a crazy professor, you drop out. You have an option to drop out. If you knew with certainty each professor's quality, you wouldn't need an add drop date. And so this is the economics of option value. And so capitalism is going to keep coming up with more options. We're going to have more renters. So one more point, and I'll let the questions open up it again. One strategy to adapt to climate change is to have more renters and fewer homeowners. Folks, if you were a renter, you could take the money you've sunk into your house and have a diversified portfolio holding assets that are less spatially affected. If you are a renter in someone else's building, if everyone in this room rents from Don Fullerton, Don would have strong incentives to hire the best University of Illinois engineer to teach him how to protect the Capitol. A mistake we've made is we have amateurs. So how many homeowners do I have in the room? Do you know how to change a toilet? Did someone yell out something I don't know how to do anything. I'm an amateur. I know I'm an amateur. If our housing stock is at risk, one way would be to switch over to a rental economy and have an owner with a comparative advantage and the skills to retrofit to make it more resilient. So I take your point, but my mind keeps spinning on how capitalism will respond. A final point. You said, Matt, do home prices, I believe in the efficient markets hypothesis, that asset prices do reflect all future known information. And I'm writing the following paper. Folks, it is possible in Miami to get data on rental prices and home prices for different properties. For different properties, there are some properties that currently don't face flood risk, but will face future flood risk. So does everyone understand my setup? For similar coastal properties, you can observe rental prices and home prices, and you can observe geographic areas that face no flood risk now, but face future flood risk. The efficient markets hypothesis predicts that current rental prices should not reflect future risk, because they're a function just of today's attributes, while home prices should reflect the discounted value of future risk. And that's the paper we're now writing. Please.
We've seen a lot of poor impacted more heavily with the hurricanes recently, and that lack of mobility is a critical issue for them. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what we can do to help?
So this is an excellent question, which I should have had a whole slide on. Folks, there is a prominent economist at Stanford University named Raj Chetty, and Raj Chetty and Nathendra Hendren and Larry Katz of Harvard have been studying Move to Opportunity. What Move to Opportunity was it was a program by HUD, by the U.S. federal government, HUD, Housing and Urban Development. And what HUD did, on his excellent point, was it took a bunch of poor people and it chose at random, so there's a kosher treatment and control group. For those randomly assigned to the treatment group, they were forced to move to a better neighborhood with less poverty. And what the researchers then studied 10 years later was they do a before-after comparison for the treatment group versus the control group, and they showed that the teenagers of the parents who participated in this program and won the lottery, so poor people who were forced because of the treatment of the program to move to a better neighborhood enjoyed better human capital outcomes. So to now answer your question, I, in a series of blog posts, have hoped that the US government would offer vouchers to move a random subset of poor people who live in increasingly dangerous neighborhoods, dangerous on climate change, not crime, for people who live in increasingly risky neighborhoods to move to higher ground. And then to study, do the lessons we've learned from Move to Opportunity, if we were to run a new field experiment on moving poor people to higher ground, it would cost millions of dollars to run, but I think what we would learn from this is that we can improve the poor's quality of life if we're able to move them to higher ground. And folks, let me say something there. A point that Paul Krugman and I agree on is that cities like San Francisco with the draconian zoning are raising middle-class home prices. So the reason Boston, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Santa Monica all have such high home prices is both demand, but also because of zoning supply. Ed Glazer of Harvard has argued that the middle class and poor get priced out of neighborhoods because single-family homeowners engage in a not in my backyard. Because zoning is local and because homeowners don't want poor people in their areas, they zone out the poor by not allowing multifamily housing, and that this is a big contributor to the challenges that the poor face. So to help the poor to adapt to climate change, we need to change zoning codes, identify higher ground, and change local zoning codes to allow for multifamily housing in those areas. I think to test the causal effects of moving poor people to safer areas, we need to have a randomized controlled trial to rigorously test if the optimism from Move to Opportunity holds for Move to higher ground.
All right, thanks for the great talk. I'd like to make a comment first. The late Professor Gilbert White, he's the father of U.S. flooding insurance. He made a very famous remark. He said, the floods are the action of God. The flood damage are the actions of human. So that means if people are smarter, we should have less flooding damage. I'm glad you're, especially in the beginning of your talk, some of your comments are consistent with that. So you talk a lot about how economists could help on land use change and also change people's behavior. I'm an engineer, actually. Water resources engineers, we are struggling the same issue. We are struggling with the shocks, the unexpected droughts and floods. So our traditional engineering design, most of them was actually based on a big assumption. So that assumption in our area we call it stationarity. So that means things could come back, things could be predicted. But today it looks like we can't. All right? We have all kinds of shocks. And then I believe both economists and engineers now we try to embrace a good idea which is called deep uncertainty. But as an engineer, we're still concerned about what kind of engineering planning or design we should make. And our fundamental principle is still benefit cost analysis, right? So under this situation, under this long stationarity situation, we facing more and more shocks. Can you share some lights on how could we estimate the cost and benefits for flooding control projects?
So I love your question. So what stationarity means to me is if we made a histogram of daily temperature. So can we agree in Urbana-Champaign, you could look up the daily temperature every day during 2016 and make a histogram. What stationarity means is that the mean and the standard deviation of that histogram is the same year in, year out. What we know from the climate science as greenhouse gas emissions increase is that the mean, at least for temperature, is rising and the standard deviation is rising. This is how Berkeley has 99-degree days. And so so one way, you're right, if the stochastic process is a random walk, that is very hard to predict by definition where that's going. But if there is a well-determined trend correlated, so these climate scientists keep saying we're now at 407 parts per million. That global atmospheric temperature correlates with that concentration correlates with average temperature. And so I think that, the climate's, again, it is easier to adapt to climate change if we know that the mean temperature is rising over time and the standard deviation of temperature is rising over time. So I would guess that 20% of Berkeley homes have air conditioning. Folks, almost nobody dies in Las Vegas or Singapore on a hot day. Everyone has air conditioning. Nolan Miller and other co-authors in Don Fullerton's department are doing very interesting work, as I understand it, of what's the mortality rate when it's hot in a place that's always hot versus what is the mortality rate even for poor people when it's hot in a place that it's never hot. When you get hit with a surprise punch, it hurts. If a punch is thrown that you see, you duck. It's not costless to duck, but air conditioning gets cheaper. The beauty of capitalism, of trading with China, is that durables like refrigeration and cell phones get ever cheaper. In Los Angeles, many poor people don't have central air conditioning, but Uber is providing free rides to cooling centers. So there's an operations research issue on a hot day of how do you identify where are the poor people who don't have air conditioners, and how do you deploy Uber or some transport technology to get them to the cooling center. You asked about flooding. In the case of flooding, I used to teach at UCLA, and after Hurricane Katrina, the great architect Thomas Maine partnered with Brad Pitt to build a floating house. And so we're going to see new designs of housing to help us to adapt to flood conditions. There's going to be very interesting issues of paving. For example, engineers at USC speak to me about permeable highways where water just goes through versus hitting and being impervious and just running off. And so as we look at our infrastructure, especially richer cities, we'll be able to finance infrastructure that reduces risk. I maintain that if real estate prices reflect risk and will be cheaper if it's riskier, this gives homeowners strong incentives to vote for politicians who support these actions. So folks, there was a speaker earlier today who said we're going to have trouble adapting to climate change because politicians serve a 4-year term, but climate change is a 100-year issue. I find that a fascinating claim, but as usual, I'm going to throw a punch. I'm among friends. If we were in private, I would throw even harder punches, but I'm on videotape. And here is my logic for what I say to that. I've argued folks, it's been argued that corporate executives should be paid with stock options. If you pay a corporate executive a fixed salary, she's going to be lazy and just play golf. But if you pay Jeff Bezos is not a dumb man, has less hair than me and much more IQ. Jeff Bezos is paid like $1 a year by Amazon. He wants to be paid in stock option because he knows where he's taking the company. I have argued that we should pay mayors with land parcels in their city, because if land parcels reflect the present discounted value of the future value of the city, you've incentivized the mayor to take a long-run perspective. It is true that a mayor who seeks to be reelected needs the votes of homeowners. If homeowners are aware that their property will suffer in value if the area becomes unlivable in the future, if Houston's quality of life is expected to decline starting the year 2025, home prices would start to fall now relative to the baseline. Homeowners who see this will begin to punish the current mayor for not taking flood control actions. And so this is a testable hypothesis. Don't want to get into a fist fight here, but because we are forward-looking creatures, whether it's a squirrel or us, can take actions to reduce our future risk. And homeowners, because they've bet their life savings on a physical place, have strong incentives to lobby a mayor. When crime goes up in a city or is expected to rise, it's clear to all of us that home prices will be low. I'm arguing that crime is to climate change risk in the same way, and that this incentivizes calling the best engineers to ask for help. And folks, one more point there. All over the world, China faces the same issues. India faces the same issues. I don't believe the words human capital have been said here. If only the United States faced flood risk, would any Chinese engineers in Shanghai be working on these issues? We only needed one Mark Zuckerberg to give us Facebook. If there's 1 million talented engineers in India, China, everywhere here at University of Illinois at MIT, what's the probability they all fail? We don't need the average engineer to crack this. We need the best. It's an elitist argument. But in a winner-take-all model, you need the best idea. If you have enough people working, you get it.
Thank you. I have a question. I reserved at least one more question for myself. But first of all, a thank you for making me the landlord for all these people. 'Cause now that I'm the monopolist landlord, I'm raising all your rent. But two problems with your earlier story about landlords in Houston who, instead of being all spread out with single-family buildings, could, when Harvey comes in and destroys enough of them, you can tear the rest, tear down the damaged structures and just put in wetlands and then go high-rise. And they would have some incentive to do that because that adaptation would make the place more attractive to live. The problem is, and you're saying you use that as an example of how the private market could solve this problem. And I would suggest the private market can't solve that problem, which is because there's a free rider problem. That there's many different landowners. They all would benefit if some of the land was set aside for wetlands. But I would like all the other landowners to set aside land for wetlands. And the city government can internalize that externality and provide that public good. And so, yes, and that's a role for local competition, as you were talking about. So that's one problem. The other problem is the $15 billion bailout just enacted by Congress when they didn't even pay insurance premiums, except general taxes to the federal government maybe, but we're going to bail out, we had a bailout for New Orleans, next bailout for Houston and Miami. That's not discouraging people from living in the flood-prone areas. We rebuilt the levees, we rebuilt the houses in New Orleans. There's not your solution of private market action to solve the climate change problem might be possible if government was not interfering in some of these other ways, but then would you want, no bailout of Houston?
So so Don is correct on his point, on the first point, on land trusts. I was assuming that the free rider problem would be overcome. And I agree with Don, local government has unique powers that it could, this actually speaks to my answer to you. Because Don is right that there's a free rider problem, as a homeowner, I would want to not pay for the wetlands and hope that everyone else does, and thus this could unravel if there isn't social capital to fuel the deal. But where Don is right is if there was a local referendum, if homeowners were asked, would you vote in favor of a taxation where the money is dedicated to purchase wetland, that would win. And so Don is correct. So don't walk away saying this crazy economist says we don't need government to adapt to climate change. A point I want you to see about government is government can play a more productive role in helping us to adapt to climate change if trusted climate science is done to collect the actual evolving risks, to disseminate this information so that there can be risk pricing without charges of fake news. And government can also play a very productive role of helping communities to finance investments. Let me give an example. Suppose that there's a poor community that can't finance a seawall. And suppose the children of the poor people are brilliant and will go on to be the next Zuckerbergs. These poor individuals can't go to a bank because you can't post your children as collateral. But if a government would issue bonds allowing the poor community to build these seawalls, this community, when these kids become successful, there'd be some taxation mechanism to get the money back. And so a debate in modern economics is the following. When government gets involved, when government builds seawalls, that can increase the number of victims if people who live in safe places now move to the crime scene because they think that they're lulled into thinking they're safe. And so a major question in modern economics is, does government investment in self-protection, is it a complement or a substitute? Does it crowd out individuals' investments in protecting themselves? And that remains an open question. Don's second question. Don, I need to prompt on the second question again. I'm having a senior moment. So I talk in the Climatopolis book of if Milton Friedman ran FEMA, of course he would have shut it down, so it's a joke, but nobody read the book. If Milton Friedman ran FEMA, that would be tough love, but we would be more resilient, because what I'm worried about is the following. If we were to go to a coastal community and knock on people's doors, we would meet some people who are ignorant of the risks they face, and climate scientists can play a role educating these individuals. But we would also meet another set of individuals who are pretending to be ignorant of the risk, but live there because they anticipate a bailout. And so there's always an issue when an unintended consequence, and that's what I meant by this distortion in the location decision of people. When government plays favorites, you're going to self-select subtle individuals who are going to pretend to be a Homer Simpson. And we as a society need to have an honest discussion. Do we view the population as 95% Mr. Spock from Star Trek and 5% Homer Simpson? Do we view it as 50-50? So I'm very interested in this mixture distribution of, as the New York Times and climate scientists continue to talk about climate change, do there continue to be a set of true climate deniers who are taking no actions to protect themselves in the voting box or in private markets? Or, as I alluded to with my discussion of hypocrisy before, is that just political posturing to say to Al Gore that this is it the case for some climate skeptics that part of their identity is that part of their identity as a person is they don't want to say that Al Gore is right? And I've cracked bad jokes that Al Gore caused climate change by making this a political issue. That makes a tough room. If John McCain had kept this a national security issue, if this had not become a partisan issue, I think there'd be a lot less work in my adaptation work. And so I think political scientists could do some very good work of how did climate change, the reason climate change became a partisan issue is because people in San Francisco questioned the preferences of people in Houston. If you like eating red meat, if you like shooting a gun on the 4th of July, do we just say live and let live? We all live once, enjoy your life. Or do you say you're a bad person and you need new preferences? I find that fascinating. Economists believe in consumer sovereignty, but believe that consumers need to face the social costs of their actions. I think that many climate deniers or climate skeptics, my sociological theory for their behavior is not that they're idiots. They have a lifestyle that they're proud of, and they don't want another group passing judgment on them. If we had made this a national security issue rather than a question of who lives a moral life, I don't think we might not be talking about climate adaptation today because we'd have a carbon tax.
So I'm just going to add further complication and get your thoughts on it. So we know that the federal flood insurance program is insuring against risk and changing rates and leading to potentially distortionary behavior by the individuals who want to protect a specific type of lifestyle or increase the value of their home. But the whole rationale for that program initially was that that's more cost effective than the bailout ex post, where the federal government, instead of insuring against that risk and creating incentives for individuals to engage in some protective mechanisms, just has to pay afterward, as in the case of Harvey, to for the damages. And we're certainly going to continue to have damages. There's no question about that, because we don't have perfect foresight and we're never going to have the perfect instruments. That's the real world. And so what then is the solution? Because it seems, or what's your solution? Because it seems that it's morally or ethically reprehensible to not provide recovery aid in the case of Harvey. And so there's always going to be this distortionary this distortion and potential additional incentive or distortionary incentive to continue to rebuild in these places. And so it just doesn't seem like there's a solution at all.
So Peter's raising a very important point, and I'm going to end on a politically correct note that I believe. Again, poor people have the right to live a dignified life in our hotter future. It is much easier to adapt to climate change if you're richer and educated, because you have more choices and more nimble to change. To reduce the US and around the world, the count of people who no longer live in poverty in China is extraordinary. In a room of free market economists, what you would hear is that the most important strategy to adapt to climate change is to end poverty. And so I'm going to stick, Peter, that if we immediately launch the basic income level, and we could debate if that's $25,000 a year, we can debate what that would be, and providing pre-K like Bill de Blasio did in New York City, with these policies, I would get rid of all this other stuff. No minimum wage, no rent control, no unions. I would remove all of this as we begin to set up a floor to protect individuals, but to face the consequences of their actions. For those who believe in more benevolent paternalism, I think climate change adaptation is going to raise this issue. Are adults adults? Or are there going to be wards of the state? I think there's going to be some very interesting issues. So if we can reduce poverty, then I'm more comfortable with Milton Friedman's vision of free to choose. I am not comfortable with our current level of poverty to remove these programs. So I think Peter's raising a great question of short-run dynamics. If we could immediately launch these initiatives, we can phase out many of the distortions that have been well-meaning but have had unintended consequences. So to end and to wrap up, because this lunch was not free, I would ask for those who support federal, state, and local intervention, do we have good estimates of the intended versus unintended consequences of these actions? In my view, the National Science Foundation should have a much larger budget to do excellent remote sensing of the risks we face. We face messaging issues of how we convey this information to the full spectrum of people, whether they're farmers or urbanites. But at the end of the day, when you enter a Starbucks, you make a choice without government influencing that. What is the difference between choosing who you marry? Government doesn't choose who you marry. What is the difference between choice of marriage, choice of car versus neighborhood? And to an economist, these are just all choices. Of course they have different consequences, but marriage is a mildly important choice, and we have, I believe we have less and less intervention there. And so again, don't walk out of here saying this nut said we can all adapt. The pathway to adaptation is more cities, more choice, and a human capital program that lifts the poor to the level that we take for granted in this room today. Folks, thank you very much.